Okay, Harry, but one of the highest profiles is another one that made the news, the national news, Longley versus Paddy Power. I may be in the minority, but I thought that most people thought pay the man.
Yeah.
Were you surprised to lose it, and what do you think went against you?
Well, sadly, what went against us was the judge, ultimately, which is often fatal in these things. I think that we were really surprised. We were really surprised by the approach. It's a High Court judge, which is a lot cleverer than me, but I suppose I'm entitled to my views on it. I think that, this was a case where James had phoned Paddy Power trader and said, can I have £1,300 each way on a horse called Redemptive at 16 to 1 at Wolverhampton? She'd said, I need to get that approved. The operator, anyone who wants to read the judgment can see the exact words, but she said, I'll get that approved. And he goes, yeah, get the stakes up, get it up. We need to get it up. I think it was something along those lines. She then speaks to a trader and she misrecords the terms of his request and says, can he have 13,000 each way? The trader, it turns out, we later learned from disclosure, looks at his ledger and decides he's chasing losses from the day before, which he subsequently put in an email, and says, yeah, we'll take that bet. So a huge bet, £13,000 each way at 16 to 1. Inevitably, the horse wins, 280-something thousand credited to his account. Very happy man. He's, extremely rich businessman, but still, it's a lot of money, and he got a huge kick out of it. And he checked his account this was, I think, on a Friday. He checked his account on the Monday, and the money had gone and been replaced by the winnings for a £1,300 each way bet. And he phoned up, and they said, well, sorry, we listened to the call, and what you phoned up for and what you wanted was a £1,300 each way bet at that point. So he instructed us, and it ended up in the High Court. And our point was really that, this must be a £13,000 each way bet, because that's what he wanted. He'd approved £26,000 coming out of the account. And it's what the Paddy Power trader wanted. And so our point was, you need to stand back and look at this in the round, really, and would it be, was Paddy Power's conduct fair in that scenario? And they came to the court. The judge took a much more technical view, which was to really analyse the language used. And she said, well, all Paddy Power were really agreeing to do was to accept the bet that he wanted to place when he first telephoned, and that was for £1,300 each way bet. So that was the bet that if any bet had been placed, that was the bet that had been placed. So that was the fundamental point we lost on. There were other issues to do with the law on common mistake and unilateral mistake, which are extremely complex issues. But one of the slightly galling elements of it was that on the subject of unilateral mistake, which was basically the judge decided that James was sort of slightly taking advantage of the bookmaker because he knew that they didn't want to place the she found he knew they didn't want to place a £26,000 bet. But of course, this is in a context where the trader, we know, looked at it and went, yeah, we'll take that huge bet off him because he's chasing his losses. So for James to have sort of been impliedly criticised in that way is a little bit galling. And I think he might have appealed it, but appeals are difficult. It's not a rehearing. You don't get to hear the evidence again. It's really marking the judge's homework. But also it had taken 9 or 10 months to get judgment at that point. And I think he just thought, enough's enough. So sadly, we didn't take that one to appeal. And yeah, it will come as no surprise that I don't think it was the right result, but it was the result.
Well, how much more of a pure betting transaction can you have when somebody asks for a bet? The person on the other end has agreed to take the bet, and then they've taken the money to cover the bet
and paid out.
That's a bet, isn't it?
And paid out.
They
didn't tell him. They didn't tell him they were taking the money out. He had to discover that himself. It turned out that the trader had basically come back after the weekend in a complete state. He wrote an apology email to his superiors saying, "I'm really sorry. I didn't know what I was thinking, but I thought he was, chasing." And he got someone else to listen to the call, and they relayed the terms of the call, and he, without telling any of his superiors or anything, he just took the money back out of the account. So, he had a huge vested interest in doing that. I can't imagine that was much of a fun weekend for him. But yeah, it's a surprising result for me.
I mean, how damaging is it to the bookmaking industry when people see these cases? So nobody can be absolutely certain that they're going to get a fair deal if they have a bet. If whenever it wins, somebody's going to try and wriggle out. Or are these cases real big exceptions to the rule?
I think you don't see many of them, do you, in the press? You might get one every couple of years. And I suppose most people think to themselves, I'm unlikely to be in a position where I have £280,000 in my Paddy Power account. So it's unlikely they're unlikely to get into this sort of thing over my, 300 quid. But yeah, it's not a good look. Of course it's not a good look. But in fairness to Paddy Power, they fought it and they won, and they were very reasonable in the way that they conducted litigation. There were no complaints about that, and it was a fair fight. And I don't think the judges' findings were perverse, but I just think that they were, I think there was room for them to be a lot more favourable to James. And as I say, I'm just surprised that they weren't really.
Okay, thanks for that, Harry. But I want to just go back to the Freddy Tylicki case, and you wanted to discuss the interference as opposed to the use of the whip in reflection and respect to that.
Yeah, I mean, I'm not the first person to make this point. Kevin Blake has been making it a lot, but it's a really important point in my view, which is that we had the other day the BHA say, Julie Harrington saying on Nick Luck's Luck on Sunday that the reason for the new whip rules is not a welfare issue, it's what she refers to as a perception issue. In other words, it doesn't look good to people outside the sport. And I don't understand for the life of me why the whip is so far up the pecking order when you have interference, and Tylicki shows what interference can do. It seems to be generally accepted, although it doesn't seem to be a complete answer to this, but it seems to be generally accepted that the modern foam whip doesn't hurt. And yet the airspace this has taken up, in the media and in regulation is extraordinary. And yet it's been something like 13 years since someone's been automatically disqualified for interference, which is an enormous welfare issue to horses and jockeys. And I just don't understand. I think we've gone through the looking glass really on this, that we're changing the rules for a welfare issue that doesn't really exist, while ignoring a very obvious welfare issue that does exist. Now, I think the BHA are looking at it, but my understanding is that they're only looking at it insofar as they're going to increase penalties to jockeys, which is the knee-jerk reaction of the regulator whenever they do anything, is just to sort of hammer jockeys further. But in my view, you need to make the penalties for dangerous riding, which you need to actually apply to dangerous riding, not the rules version of dangerous riding, which is almost impossible to meet that definition. You need to make it a proper deterrent, and just endlessly increasing the penalties that jockeys will have to face isn't going to do that, because you see them coming back from a big race and with a big grin on their face and just saying, I think I'm off for a little holiday now. That's not a deterrent. And yeah, the other sort of mentioned earlier, the other big case in my racing career was the Jim Best proceedings, which I don't think anyone expected to explode in the way it did, but Jim was charged with instructing an apprentice jockey to stop two horses, and we went before the disciplinary panel of the BHA, and he was found in breach of a 34, I think it is, which is bringing, I'm not sure it is that rule actually, but bringing racing into disrepute. And he got an exclusion of 4 years. almost immediately it emerged that the chairman of that panel had had been employed by the BHA in his capacity as a solicitor, and we were very worried about that and said, well, this doesn't look good. It's what's called the appearance of bias. No one ever suggested that he was biased. It's important to make that point, but the law treats the appearance of bias as the same thing as bias, largely, firstly, because you can't get inside someone's head and decide whether they're biased, but secondly, also because it's important that justice is seen to be done. Somewhat extraordinarily, the BHA said that this was a desperate argument to begin with when we first launched the appeal, and they were very firm on that view. And then we went up in front of the appeal board, and we had Anthony Boswood, who was an experienced arbitration barrister and actually knew an awful lot about the rules on bias as a result, because it comes up quite a lot in arbitration panels. And he made it clear that this was a really big deal. And the BHA backed down at that point, and there was an appeal. We won on two grounds. One was an insufficiency of reasons. The reasons in the written decision didn't support the panel's finding. And two, the appearance of bias of the chairman. So we ended up in this very strange situation, which was the BHA then announced the Quinlan review, which was a review into the disciplinary function. I can't remember exactly what the title was, but it was essentially a review into the disciplinary function of the BHA. And the BHA wanted to have, and we waited all summer, months went by and the rehearing wasn't happening. And then the BHA were very keen to get the hearing in. I think it was almost sort of 2 weeks before the Quinlan review came out. And we were saying, well, I mean, that's not a good idea, because the Quinlan review might come out and say, give a whole lot of recommendations that haven't been applied to the rerunning of Best, when it was Best that caused this in the first place. And we ended up at this extraordinary hearing in front of William Norris. I think it was William Norris. And it was a hearing that wasn't a hearing. It was a non-binding hearing, which nothing improper about it. But it was basically, we turned up on the basis that we were making the submissions that we would make if this was a real hearing. And he would give us his decision that he would have made if it was a real hearing, because we didn't want to submit to the BHA's jurisdiction, because we wanted to retain the right to go to the High Court. And he found in our favour, and the Quinlan review then came out, and the hearing happened again, and this time we got much better disclosure from the BHA. There had not been proper disclosure the first time round. And one of the things that was disclosed was an email between the relevant jockey and the BHA about his giving evidence and what effect that might have. We said that was evidence of a deal that would impact on his evidence, on the weight that could be given to his evidence, because he might have an incentive. And the BHA said, absolutely not, absolutely not. Anyway, Jim lost again, but got only 6 months, second time round, of disqualification rather than exclusion. And the BHA and the panel found that was a deal between the jockey and the BHA to give, essentially, for him to give evidence. So it was explosive, really, at the time, and as I say, not just in racing but across sports. I've had a lot of sports lawyers saying to me, God, I have to think twice now about what panels I join and that kind of thing, because I think sports law can sometimes become quite its own little world, and I think Jim Best was sort of rather shining a light on it for the first time in a while, on the way that sort of things can happen when you have a microcosm. And I think the Quinlan review really sort of sorted it out, to be honest with you, so far as I can tell.